outage happened last night. So we'll certainly understand if you need to get up and do jumping jacks or whatever to stay warm. Stay warm. We are very privileged at University of Dallas to have back with us today Paul Benson from Mountain View College. Paul will be continuing his interesting series about the role of certain commodities in human history and how our interaction with them has shaped what we've become. And today we'll be talking about the commodities of tea and coffee. Paul?
Thank you, David. I appreciate it very much. Thank you all for coming. Last week I ended with a cliffhanger. But there are a few of you that weren't here last week, so I'd like to repeat the cliffhanger, and it's this. What do spices, we've been talking about spices. What do spices, the internet, and ham have to do with each other? Now, you had a week, some of you, to think about that. Have you come up with an idea? Anybody?
Spam?
Correct. Yes. Spam. So here's the story there, which is kind of a little convoluted, but there was a company in Austin, Minnesota, Hormel. And Hormel had a problem in the processing plant. They couldn't get rid of the cell around the joints. There was meat that would attach, and around the bone and sinew. It was very hard to use this, and they developed a process to get this meat out, because it was just going to waste. It was just being thrown away, more or less. And so they turned it into this concoction. They added some spice to the ham, the shoulder ham, and they put it in a can. And they called it Spam, from what word? Words, spice, ham.
Internet.
Yeah. Well, that's the old cart before the horse. See? So what happened is, in let me give you a date on this. So in 1975, there was a movie called Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's a line in there that says, we eat ham and jam and lots of Spam. Now, for an English person, this makes some sense, because during World War II, almost the only source of meat that civilians had was Spam, because the American military ordered up millions of tons of Spam from this little plant in Austin, Minnesota, and sent it to Europe. England got lots of it, and then they sent it also to the Pacific, particularly the countries, the locales of Hawaii and of Guam. The largest per capita consumption of Spam today is in Guam, and Hawaii is not far behind. Now, so what happens in this Monty Python Holy Grail is the point that during the war, there's only meat they had. So you would eat lots of Spam with something. So it'd be Spam and potatoes, Spam and macaroni, Spam and spinach. I mean, anything you could think of. And so this idea that it was just the endless, repetitive, same thing over and over, it was still, no matter how you fixed it up, you were still eating Spam. And so somehow then, when the musical 2005 came out, Monty Python, it was called Spamalot. It's the musical version of the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but it's the musical version. And there, Spamalot is in there. So this idea of Spamalot became very, very popular. And somebody thought, well, that's a good word to describe this repetitive junk you get on, over and over and over again, you get on the internet. And so that's the source of the word spam, which is now taken on a life of its own, right? And this is why word history is so fascinating. How you'll start somewhere and the thing evolves around and means something totally and utterly and completely different than what it first meant, right? I want to talk to you about one more spice before we move on to tea and coffee. One of the most valuable of all spices was nutmeg. Now the reason nutmeg was so valuable is because they got to believing that nutmeg was going to keep away the plague, the bubonic plague. Now, back in the Middle Ages, the plague probably was delivered by spice ships from Asia. And so, nowadays we understand about Asian flu and all the, various strains that come, the avian flu and so forth. All these strains that come from the East, but, back in the Middle Ages they didn't understand it. But they got to believing that nutmeg was used as a preventative. Because they did think, they weren't too far off, they thought that flu was carried by mice and rats, and that the mice and rats did not like nutmeg, and so it kind of scared them off. So what happened is nutmeg became very valuable for its medicinal, and then particularly its plague preventing characteristics, right? Now, this really gets strange, because what happened is the Dutch eventually replaced the Portuguese in the Spice Islands, and were able to eventually control the whole nutmeg trade in the entire world. They had an absolute monopoly on nutmeg. Now, the way they got this is very interesting, and I'd like to give you the year here. In 1667, there was the Treaty of Breda, B-R-E-D-A, Breda. And at the Treaty of Breda, the Dutch and the English agreed to make a trade. And this is the trade they made. The Dutch wanted an English island in the Spice Islands called Run, R-U-N. And this island, of course, was perfect for growing nutmeg. And if the Dutch could get this island to run, they would have a monopoly, because nutmeg grows nowhere else in the entire world at that time but the Spice Islands. So they made a deal. We will trade you, the Dutch said, we will give you one of our islands in North America. Guess what the name of the island was? Manhattan. So in 1667, the Dutch pulled out of New York, and of course it was called New Amsterdam, and the English came in and settled and took it over. And of course the Dutch that lived there were very upset about this, because now they had to share their island with the English people. And I've told this story many times, but some of you haven't heard it, so I'll tell it again. So the Dutch, of course, were very proud of their culture and very proud of their ways of doing things. And they looked down greatly at the English, who they considered kind of, not barbarians, but an inferior culture, particularly in the area of cheese making. The Dutch, of course, very famous for their cheese markets and their great expertise in cheese making. The English have never taken a great interest in cheese. They have cheese, but it's not an obsession with them. And so the Dutch, living in their little Dutch communities down there in the tip of Manhattan and up in Harlem and so forth, these were all Dutch communities at that time. The Dutch would have do their trading along the wall, and that wall, of course, was the wall to keep out the Indians. And there's a little trading they have every day. They'd open the gates up, and the Indians would come in and they'd trade. And of course, that street, because it was on the wall, it's called Wall Street. Well, anyway, the Dutch took to calling the English poor cheese people. And they would say this. They would say this in Dutch. Now the word for cheese in Dutch is key. And then of course they would call them, and the word for bad is Jan. Yankee. Or we'd say Yankee. The bad cheese guys. And, so the English, weren't very good at Dutch. They just thought Yankee was a description of English people that were living there, and so they said, yeah, we're Yankees. It's like Mexico. Americans will happily call themselves gringo, right? Which is at one time a pejorative word. But then, strangely enough, when the English started taking cricket and starting a simplified version of cricket called rounders, one of the very first teams they called was New York Yankees. And the English then changed the name, and this became an American sport. Of course, rounders became baseball. So out of the Dutch obsession, you might say, with cheese comes this very fascinating name. Again, here we are, just a few minutes into this talk, we've already talked about the evolution of two words. It's sort of where I end up always going, right? Discussions. By the way, back about nutmeg, remind us of the plague. There's a famous nursery rhyme, ring around the rosies, pocket full of posies. The ring around the rosy was the sign that you had the plague. And the pocket full of posies was to help you smell better when you died. Ka-choo, we all fall down. In other words, they would start coughing and hacking and throwing up blood. And so this was, yeah, I know, it's pretty grim. This is a children's way of kind of dealing with what was a very, very unhappy situation, right? By the way, one of the many ingredients in Coca-Cola is nutmeg. Now, I want to talk to you about tea and coffee today. These are so amazingly interesting topics. England, which is, of course, today known for great tea drinking and tea time and all of that, but originally had no tea at all. I mean, tea starts coming in the 17th century, but then all of a sudden tea overwhelms, and I want to talk about why that happened. The English were not buying tea originally because it was extremely expensive. In fact, one of the reasons the English first went to coffee is because coffee was much cheaper. But what happened is the British East Indies Company started flooding the market in England with tea because this was their number one import into England, number one export out of India. And the price just came down to where tea was just very inexpensive, and coffee stayed relatively expensive to tea. And that process explains why the British went from having coffee houses to having tea houses. They started with, by the way, they didn't have tea houses the way they had coffee houses. They had tea gardens. Now, I found this quite astonishing. One of the tea gardens that was built in this early 1700s, the name of the tea garden, may I ask my good friend,
Somebody.
Sound guy.
Plug it in, I think. And I'm plugged.
Yeah, if you know the spot.
Yeah.
If I can see it.
If you can get down that far.
Try it.
Testing, yeah, thank you.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I'll try not to do that again.
Well,
Oh, yeah, you're just hanging on there, right? We had a tea garden called the Parthenon. Now, why this tea garden is interesting to me, you know, they eventually had thousands of tea gardens. And, but Parthenon Tea Garden was among the most famous because here's what happened. Jimmy Lankott will be particularly interested in this little piece of information. At the Parthenon, it's the first time on record that anybody knows of where it was appropriate for women to ask men to buy them tea. You say, well, you know, what's the big deal? That never happened in anybody's experience before that tea garden. And so that is a kind of revolutionary change where women can do the asking. So the young men would come to the Parthenon and hang around, and then the women would come in and ask a certain young man to buy tea. And that, in other words, initiate the conversation, initiate the relationship. This is really, really amazing. What's particularly fascinating, though, Parthos means virgin, non means temple. This is, of course, the great temple, named for the great temple in Athens of Athena, the virgin goddess. And so it was in the tea garden of the Virgin where women were allowed to ask men. And I think Athena would be pretty devastated by this, and she was extremely masculine in her ways. What happens is this. Tea becomes the obsession of the English. In other words, they monopolize the tea industry. And by the way, the most famous of all brands of tea, of course, is Lipton. But Lipton was just one of many, many in England at the time. Anyway, what evolved in the tea business was called the Triangle of Death. The Triangle of Death. I want to talk to you about the Triangle of Death. So what the British would do is they controlled India, or at least they controlled the eastern half of India. Eventually they controlled the whole country, but in the eastern half of India, they're growing opium. But it's illegal for them to trade in opium. So they developed this elaborate system. So they would grow the opium, and then they'd take the opium. Now they were able to use opium in those days for medicine, but you know, under very strict control. What they wanted to do is take it to China. So they couldn't take it to China. So they hire these local firms to take the opium to China. And when they get to China, they sell it. The Chinese pay them in gold and silver. And the gold and silver was then essentially turned into British East Indies certificates, which were literally coin of the round. And then they would buy tea, and with that money, and send it back to England. So all they were shipping, you see, was tea to England, and then of course more gold and silver came back, and they just got fabulously wealthy doing this. But of course it caused the country of China to become extremely addicted. Opium dens were everywhere during this time in the 1800s in China. The Chinese eventually tried to break this, and the English were not going to have it. So they eventually fight in the 1830s, the Opium War. And the Opium War is over whether or not China can have any opium. The British, of course, win easily the war, and opium starts flowing again. And opium was a staple in China until the Mao Zedong came in and just crushed it and obliterated. And so, although there's still opium to be sure in China, it's not as big as it was back in this time, because the British, this was the dirty secret of why they're becoming so incredibly wealthy. By the way, the British eventually take over the British East India Company and then put it out of business. And so, in other words, why let this company make all the money when the crown can make all the money? And so, literally, the British government, the British crown, is running the opium business in China for, well, another almost 100 years, all total, because later they have the Boxer Rebellion and so forth. Now, when you talk about tea and coffee, they kind of run into each other. Coffee, of course, has a history which is tied up with the Muslim religion. The reason for that is coffee comes from originally from Yemen. One of the most famous ports in Yemen is called Mocha, right? And so they would ship all this coffee out of Mocha and coffee beans. Well, anyway, coffee in its original form is very kind of thick paste. It's the kind of thing that was very, very strong. And then, but because it was so expensive, people started watering it down. And so to this day, we drink the watered down version of it. And so the Muslim interest in coffee is a substitute for alcohol. There's no alcohol. So you will see, even to this day, if you go to, say, Egypt or another predominantly Muslim country, you'll see these coffee sellers and they're selling these little teeny cups. But you just like use your tongue to get a little taste, but it's really, really strong. Anyway, so it spreads to Europe. And by the 17th century, by the middle of the 17th century, you have coffee houses. The very first coffee house in England was in 1650. And coffee became the thing. 1650, by the way, is when the Puritans are in control of England. They're also somewhat unhappy, or they don't like the idea of taverns. And so they like to meet in coffee houses. And these coffee houses were interesting institutions because people could come there and talk about things, politically speaking. And so it becomes something of an egalitarian institution where people come and share ideas. Does anybody here know the world's most famous coffee house in London? That's a good guess. Of course, it's hard for us to believe that Starbucks didn't come into existence until the 1970s in Seattle. So it's a very late comer and into the thing. And by the way, here's an irony. We still call restaurants by the name, the French name for coffee, which is café, right? And so we will say, I'll meet you at the cafe, but Starbucks, which is the #1 purveyor of coffee now in the world, is not called a cafe. So it's how words are used and then no longer are used is also a fascinating study. Well, anyway, coffee, the most famous coffee house in England that was opened in 1771 is Lloyd's of London.
Really?
See, that's Lloyd was had a coffee house, and what happened is the insurance guys started coming, and so over time it became the place where the insurance men showed up, and then they started cutting deals, and then they started writing contracts, and they had the reputation of Lloyd's in London of writing a contract on anything. Right? If you were willing to pay the premium, they would insure your voice. They would insure your hair. They would insure anything you wanted to insure that you might lose, right? And I don't know if they insured teeth. Probably back then not. But anyway, one of the reasons that tea, I think, took over from coffee in England is because the British government taxed it by the gallon, which meant this: they had to cook it way beforehand and then bring these barrels into the coffee house and then take it out and reheat it. So everybody was eating reheated coffee. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think reheated coffee is all that great, right? And but that's one reason I think coffee somewhat died out in England, but tea took over. And we'll talk about in a minute why the Americans prefer coffee over tea, generally speaking. By the way, in the coffee houses in France were interesting. There was one particular coffee house where the great scholar Diderot in 1772 assembled his Encyclopedia. Now, this is one of the world's great compendiums of knowledge, and he wanted to have all the knowledge in the whole world, and so he sat in that coffee house collecting, data and putting it together in his many volume set of the world's first encyclopedia. So that's one of the things that come out of the coffee house. French coffee houses were open to women. This is another, again, this is before the French Revolution, and this is surprising. Oh, by the way, does anybody know the individual who allowed the first women to preach? Anybody have any idea?
To preach.
To preach. It's very, very rare before the 20th century to see women preaching. The man's name was John Wesley. And toward the end of his career, these two women came to him and asked him if they could preach, and he let them. And got into, of course, a lot of trouble. The French Revolution, in many ways, was started in a coffee house called the Café de Foy, and in that year, important year of 1789. And the American Revolution, there was in Boston a coffee house called the Green Dragon, where Daniel Webster held forth, and that was kind of the headquarters of the American Revolution. And so coffee houses play a role in the French Revolution and in the American Revolution. By the way, because remember the Boston Tea Party and all that, I'm not going to spend the time to go in that history because I'm sure you understand that it was the taxation on tea that caused Americans to be really, really upset with the British government, an excise tax. And so the Continental Congress, one of the first acts of the Continental Congress was to make the consumption, not the sale, but the consumption of tea illegal in America. That gives you an idea that, in other words, we are not going to let the British sell us any tea and pay any tax on tea, because if nobody has tea, then is drinking tea. So then there can be no tax from the tea. So this is one of the transition points, and why coffee has always been very, very big in American history. I want to have this kind of personal theory about coffee. Coffee seems to be most popular where the climate is the coldest. I give you as an example of that, the greatest coffee consumption in the world are in the Scandinavian countries, right? Norway, Sweden, and so forth. They just drink oceans of coffee and always have. Now, I was trying to figure out why so many of the famous brand names come out of San Francisco, including Folgers, Farmers Brothers, Hills Brothers, MJB. Any of you old enough to remember MJB? That was a big brand in the 1950s in America. I don't think you can buy MGB anymore. But anyway, and I got to wondering, well, why would San Francisco be such a center of coffee? Then it hit me what Mark Twain said. Mark Twain said, the coldest winter I ever spent in my entire life was one summer in San Francisco. And that pretty well sums it up. And of course, where does Starbucks go? No, Seattle. Seattle, and I remember there was this kind of sea change in Seattle and Western Washington, in Puget Sound area. It got to the point where you couldn't go to, say, Home Depot without having a coffee kiosk, right? You go to church. All these churches would put up coffee kiosks in the lobby. And this became a big deal, right? And so this association of coffee with socializing is very, very strong. And so the whole notion that coffee is something, if the weather is really cold, then it just gives you a momentary comfort, right? So what do you do in Texas? You invent Frappuccino, right? And so we have all these ice drinks. And because here, hot coffee in the summer isn't a big seller. I've told you, some of you have heard this before, but the most successful of all coffee entrepreneurs in the United States was a man from Fort Worth, Texas, by the name of C.W. Post. Now, Post's story is an amazing, long-winded story, but the gist of it is that he went and met Kellogg because he was going to be cured of his great fits of depression by Kellogg in the sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. And there he learned that all the great things that Kellogg was working on, and among those things, of course, was a substitute for coffee. So coffee was something that Post and all of his, and Kellogg, and all these health guys believed was a big enemy at the time. And so they wanted to get people off of coffee. And so Post set up his own company and created his own non-coffee coffee called Postum. And Postum was made out of grain. It tastes a little reminiscent of coffee. But anyway, Postum set up his company in Battle Creek. It ultimately gets moved to New York. It ultimately changed its name to General Foods. But what's ironic is this anti-coffee company called Postum. This anti-coffee company ends up having America's most popular regular coffee, cafe